He left her with 5 cold words: "I'm leaving for someone else." 2 years later, he saw her again, holding 3 blonde daughters with his blue eyes. Sophie Brooks had always believed that love ended with closure, a final conversation, a tearful goodbye, some kind of mutual understanding that what once mattered no longer could. She never imagined it could end with a single cold text message on a random Tuesday afternoon. But that was exactly how her world fell apart. She had been finishing a presentation for Harrison's upcoming investors' meeting when her phone buzzed on the table beside her. Without looking, she assumed it was him, letting her know he would be late again or that dinner plans were changed. Instead, she saw 8 words that made her vision blur: "I'm leaving for someone else. Don't call me." It didn't sound like him. Not the man who kissed her forehead every morning before work. Not the man who rested his chin on her shoulder while she cooked and told her he was lucky to have found her. Not the man she had planned a future with. She stared at the message so long that the phone dimmed, but the words remained burned into her eyes. She tried calling him, once, twice, 6 times. Each went straight to voicemail. His presence in her life, which had once felt so permanent, vanished like smoke. His spare key was gone from the hook by the door. His suits were missing from the closet. The framed photo of the 2 of them from their trip to San Francisco, one where he smiled genuinely, soft and unguarded, was turned face down on the shelf. It was as if he had swept every trace of himself out of her life before pressing send. Sophie collapsed to the living room floor, her fingers tangled in her dark brown hair as sobs choked her. The apartment suddenly seemed enormous and unbearably empty. Her mind raced with every memory: the night they met at a business conference when he complimented her intelligence instead of her looks, the first time he told her she made him believe in softness, the promises whispered in a quiet bed at midnight. She had trusted him with every vulnerable corner of her heart. She had believed love made her stronger. But now, she felt foolish for not seeing the warning signs: how he had become more distant, how his compliments had turned into silent nods, how his touch had grown rare. She had thought it was stress, pressure from being a CEO at such a young age. She never imagined she was the burden he was trying to escape. Her tears slowed only when a sharp pain pierced her abdomen. It wasn't the first time she had felt it. For weeks, she had woken nauseous, dizzy, fatigued. At first, she blamed long work hours and anxiety. But deep inside, she knew there was another possibility, one she hadn't dared to acknowledge until this moment. Hands still trembling, Sophie stood and made her way to the bathroom. She opened a drawer and took out the pregnancy test she had bought 3 days earlier. She sat on the cool tile floor, heart pounding as she waited for the result. When the digital screen displayed the words she had both feared and hoped for, she let out a shaky breath. Pregnant. Her tears returned, but they were different now, not just of heartbreak, but of overwhelming responsibility. She pressed her hand to her stomach, as if she could suddenly feel life moving beneath her skin. She imagined the moment she would have shared the news with him. She pictured his shock turning into excitement, his hands gently covering hers, his promise that they would figure it all out together. Instead, she was alone. More alone than she had ever felt in her life. And even though she wanted to scream, to beg for him to come back, she wiped her face and forced herself to breathe. Harrison had made his choice. He had walked away without looking back. But she couldn't. There was a future inside her now, one she hadn't planned, but one she already loved fiercely. That night, she sat by the window as the city lights flickered beyond the glass. She wrapped her arms around her knees, whispering to the tiny life inside her that everything would be okay. She would find a way. She would work harder, be stronger. She would give this child the love they deserved, even if their father never wanted to know they existed. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Morning crept in slowly, casting a pale glow across the apartment that had once felt like a sanctuary. It was just a space now, filled with memories she couldn't bear to keep. She stood up, found a suitcase, and began packing. Her movements were slow but determined. Fold. Zip. Breathe. Don't think. By the time the sun rose fully, Sophie Brooks locked the door behind her and walked away with tears still drying on her cheeks and a silent vow growing inside her chest: she would never again let anyone decide her worth. Harrison Gray had called her disposable without saying a word. But she would prove, to him, to the world, and to herself, that nothing about her or her child was a mistake. She had been abandoned, but she refused to break. That was the moment Sophie stopped needing someone else to save her. She didn't realize it yet, but she had already begun saving herself. Sophie left Chicago before she had time to doubt her decision. She couldn't stay in the city where every street and every coffee shop felt like a reminder that she had not been enough for the man she once believed she would marry. She packed what she could fit into one suitcase, sold most of the furniture online for cash, and used her remaining savings to buy a bus ticket to a small town in Wisconsin she had picked almost blindly from a map. It was the kind of place she used to imagine when she needed to breathe: quiet streets, modest homes, friendly smiles instead of hurried glances. It felt safer. It felt like somewhere she could disappear long enough to rebuild herself. She rented a tiny cottage on the outskirts of town, one bedroom barely large enough for a bed and dresser, a kitchen with outdated appliances, and thin walls that let in too much winter air. But the windows looked out onto a forest instead of skyscrapers, and at night she could hear wind through the trees instead of traffic and sirens. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. She found a job almost immediately at a local bakery, even though the pay was low and the hours early. She would arrive before dawn, kneading dough while morning frost hugged the windows, forcing her tired body to keep moving even when her heart still ached from everything she'd left behind. The pregnancy was far more exhausting than she had imagined. The nausea clung to her throughout the day, and her belly grew faster than seemed normal. At her second appointment at the tiny clinic, the doctor frowned thoughtfully at the ultrasound screen. Sophie held her breath, terrified that something was wrong. When the doctor finally spoke, her tone was cautious but kind: "There's more than one heartbeat." The words hung in the air like a puzzle Sophie couldn't quite piece together. It wasn't until the doctor rotated the monitor slightly and pointed to 3 tiny flickering lights that the truth hit her like a tidal wave. Triplets. 3 babies. 3 lives. It felt impossible. It felt terrifying. It felt like a miracle and a burden at the same time. The news forced Sophie into survival mode. She budgeted every dollar to the point of obsession. She bought her maternity clothes at thrift stores, choosing the cheapest items she could find even if they were worn. She set up a small spreadsheet on her cracked laptop, calculating future expenses with trembling hands: diapers, formula, clothing, medical bills. The numbers made her dizzy. But every kick inside her reminded her she wasn't allowed to give up. When her legs swelled, when her back screamed in pain after hours of standing in the bakery, she would place her palms gently on her stomach and whisper, "It's okay, babies. We'll get through this. I promise." Her belly grew so large that even strangers noticed early on. They would smile and ask if she was excited, if she knew the genders, if the father was thrilled. Sophie learned to swallow her hurt and smile back. She didn't talk about Harrison. She didn't owe the world her pain. But loneliness found her anyway. At night, she lay awake, staring at the dim glow of her alarm clock, terrified that she'd fail them. She practiced deep breathing when anxiety made it hard to think. She stopped calling her parents after they once again dismissed her with, "You made your bed, Sophie." She accepted that her children would be born into a family of 4, and that she alone would be their anchor. That winter was harsh. Snow piled against her door and cold crept under every windowpane. But she moved forward, step by step, day by day. Some mornings she woke feeling strong, ready to take on the world. Others she cried into her pillow before forcing herself up again. She often wondered whether Harrison ever thought of her. She doubted it. The man who'd sent that message felt like a stranger now, someone polished and heartless and distant enough to erase her with a text. She told herself that his absence was a blessing. Better a cut from a clean blade than a slow poison from a toxic love. The night her water broke, the sky was dark and heavy with snow. The pain came like a hand gripping her spine, and panic set in so fast she could barely breathe. She called an ambulance because she had no one else. The blur of the hospital, bright lights, cold hands, rushed instructions, felt like a nightmare she was drifting through. Triplets wanted out earlier than expected. The delivery was long, complicated, and terrifying. There were moments she thought she wouldn't survive. But then she heard the first cry. Then the second. Then the third. Lily. Luna. Lex. Sophie saw them only briefly before they were rushed to the NICU, 3 tiny miracles wrapped in wires and surrounded by machines that beeped like fragile heartbeats. They were impossibly small, impossibly beautiful. All 3 had blonde fuzz on their heads and eyes as blue as a summer sky, even though they barely opened them. She cried, not from sadness, but from a love so fierce it frightened her. She reached through the incubator's window to touch their little hands, fingers no larger than seeds curling instinctively around her pinky. The hospital kept Sophie for several days, but even after she was discharged, she refused to leave. She sat beside the incubators every hour she was allowed, reading aloud picture books she borrowed from the library and singing songs she barely remembered from her childhood. Nurses tried to coax her back to her room to rest, but she stayed rooted in that chair, watching every breath her daughters took. Weeks later, when the girls were finally strong enough to go home, the nurse helped Sophie buckle them into 3 mismatched car seats someone had donated. Sophie looked into the back seat at her daughters bundled in hand-me-down blankets and promised them quietly, "You will never be unwanted. Not for a second. Not for a heartbeat. You are my family. You are my strength." She drove away from the hospital with fear in her throat and hope swelling in her heart. Her world had collapsed once. Now, she was rebuilding a new one lullaby at a time, one breath at a time, one tiny miracle at a time. Harrison Gray's life after Sophie's disappearance had the illusion of perfection. From the outside, he remained the picture of success. His name regularly appeared in business magazines, his company continued to expand internationally, and his social media presence was carefully curated with photos of private jets, oceanfront resorts, and champagne-drenched parties. There was always a woman on his arm, usually models or entrepreneurs who matched his world in status and ambition. To the public, Harrison was thriving, untouchable, the kind of man whose past was always clean and whose future was always golden. But behind the sharp suits and camera-ready smile, something had shifted in him. And though he refused to admit it to anyone else, he felt it every day. He had believed walking away from Sophie would be clean. Simple. Necessary. She had started wanting things, more time, more commitment, more vulnerability, and that made him uncomfortable in ways he hadn't wanted to examine. When she began to drift emotionally closer, when she asked about the future, about children, about family, he felt a tightness in his chest that reminded him of everything he had been taught to avoid. His father had taught him that love was a distraction and that vulnerability was weakness. Harrison had lived by those lessons. So when Sophie became too real, too deep, too close, he cut the thread. One message, 8 words, and he thought the problem was solved. But what he hadn't expected was the echo. It started as a silence that followed him into rooms where he once felt powerful. The boardroom felt colder. The applause at events rang hollow. He went on dates and forgot their names before dessert. He smiled, but it never reached his eyes. Sophie's name was never spoken again, not even to his assistant, who had once helped arrange her birthday surprises. He buried every trace of her. And yet, she lingered. She would appear suddenly in the most inconvenient places, in the scent of cinnamon rolls at a hotel buffet, in a song playing low in a car he didn't own, in the way someone else's laugh would rise in a crowded space. He saw her everywhere, and yet she was nowhere. He tried to drown her memory in work. He poured himself into the next acquisition, the next merger, the next climb. The higher he rose, the more distant the ground felt. His penthouse became a glass cage. The silence at night grew so thick it wrapped around him like a second skin. At times, he would wake up from dreams he couldn't explain, dreams of a woman with brown eyes holding his hand and pulling it gently towards something he couldn't see. Once, he even saw a child in the dream, blonde, giggling, disappearing into fog. He shook it off and dismissed it as stress. But the dreams returned. Softer. Clearer. Louder. One afternoon, during a meeting with investors, someone mentioned a charity for children in rural hospitals. Harrison nodded absently, but something in his chest tightened. The image of a hospital crib flashed in his mind, though he had never seen one. The thought came out of nowhere, sharp and specific, followed by a cold realization he couldn't shake: Sophie had never called. Never followed up. Never begged him to come back. She had vanished. Cleanly. Completely. And the silence suddenly didn't feel like peace. It felt like a missing piece. That night, he opened an old drawer he hadn't touched in years. Buried beneath travel documents and unopened letters was a photograph. Sophie, smiling, sunlight in her hair, taken on the last day they spent in Central Park. He stared at it for a long time. He remembered how she laughed that day, how she fed squirrels peanuts from her coat pocket, how she talked about children without even realizing it. The sound of her voice returned to him, soft but certain, saying, "I think when you really love someone, you stay. No matter how scared you are." He hadn't stayed. He had run. The next morning, he asked his assistant to quietly search for Sophie. He didn't explain why. He told himself it was out of curiosity. Closure. A sense of responsibility, maybe. But when the assistant returned weeks later, saying she had no social media, no forwarding address, no trace anywhere, Harrison felt something sink inside him. She hadn't just disappeared from his life. She had erased herself entirely. He didn't know if she had moved on or if she was struggling. He didn't know if she had ever seen his message and cried or laughed or felt relief. And the fact that he didn't know gnawed at him more than he expected. As weeks turned to months, the thoughts grew louder. She had loved him. Genuinely. And he had chosen power, image, safety over a woman who gave him everything. What if she had needed him? What if she had been pregnant? The idea came like a whisper. Then a scream. It was irrational, he told himself. It couldn't be true. And yet, it stayed. The possibility lived in the back of his mind like a shadow that refused to fade. He tried to dismiss it, but he couldn't stop looking at children in public spaces. Couldn't stop noticing blonde toddlers. Couldn't stop wondering. He didn't realize it yet, but his heart was already shifting. Something in him had begun to thaw, not from logic or pressure, but from something far more dangerous: regret. He started making quiet changes, donating more money to children's hospitals, showing up to work meetings in small towns instead of sending junior executives, even volunteering for causes he used to mock. He couldn't name what he was doing, only that he needed to move. Needed to be in motion. Because standing still meant feeling everything at once. And feeling, for a man like Harrison Gray, had always been the most terrifying thing of all. It was supposed to be just another routine trip. Harrison had agreed to attend a small-town charity event in Wisconsin on behalf of his company's philanthropic division, which had recently begun investing in local community outreach programs. He hadn't expected much, just a few speeches, a handshake with the mayor, and a quick flight back to New York before the weekend. But from the moment he stepped off the private jet, there was something different in the air. The town was quiet but full of character, with old brick buildings, cafes with chalkboard signs, and a sense of stillness he hadn't felt in years. Still, he told himself it was just another appearance to fulfill, just another tick on a long list of public relations obligations. He didn't know that within hours, his entire world would be ripped open in the most unexpected way. The charity gala was held at a restored historic train station turned event hall, with high ceilings, fairy lights strung along wooden beams, and long tables lined with mismatched chairs that gave it a rustic charm. Local families, donors, and children attended in their best outfits, and the atmosphere was warm and intimate. Harrison arrived in a tailored suit, every inch of him polished and in control. He shook hands, offered polite smiles, and gave his practice speech about the importance of community investment and how children's health initiatives were close to his heart. The words rolled off his tongue easily, but something inside him felt disconnected, like he was watching himself from a distance. As the dinner began, he retreated to a quiet corner, sipping his wine while observing the laughter and noise around him. That's when he saw her. At first, he didn't believe it was real. She was standing near the dessert table, wearing a simple wine-colored dress, her dark brown hair pulled back in a loose braid. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a quiet elegance about her that pulled the air out of his lungs. Sophie. Her name struck him like a bell, sudden and deafening. She hadn't changed much, but she had grown stronger somehow, like someone who had walked through fire and come out forged instead of burned. He took a single step forward, unsure if he was dreaming. Then he saw them. 3 little girls in identical white cardigans and navy blue dresses stood beside her, each with pale blonde curls and striking blue eyes. They couldn't have been more than 2 years old. One was tugging at her mother's skirt, another was licking frosting from her fingers, and the third was hugging a stuffed bear tightly against her chest. Harrison's heart slammed against his ribs. He stared, his breath stolen by the impossible symmetry of their faces. His face. His eyes. His mouth. There was no question, no doubt, no hesitation in his bones. They were his. The room seemed to shrink around him. The background noise dissolved into a low hum, and for a moment, the only thing he could see was the small universe that existed around Sophie. He wanted to rush to them, to demand answers, to fall to his knees and ask why she hadn't told him, but his feet remained frozen. Sophie turned slowly, as if sensing the weight of his gaze. Her eyes met his across the room, and everything stilled. She didn't flinch. Didn't smile. Didn't look away. There was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, quiet calm that unnerved him more than any anger could have. He took a step toward her, and she immediately bent down to adjust one of the girl's shoes, as if dismissing him with a single movement. But it wasn't indifference. It was something colder, control. She was protecting them from him. That truth struck him harder than anything else. He waited until the dinner wound down, keeping his distance but unable to stop watching. Every small gesture between them gutted him. How Sophie touched their shoulders, whispered gently into their ears, laughed at their jokes. She had become the kind of mother who turned a room into safety. He realized, with a sharp pang of guilt, that she had done it all alone. No help. No support. Just her strength, her will, and her love. He managed to catch her near the entrance as the event was ending. The girls were bundled into tiny coats, 2 of them sleepy, 1 cranky. He opened his mouth to speak, but Sophie's expression stopped him. "Not here," she said quietly. "Not in front of them." Her voice was even, not cruel. She didn't owe him that grace, but she gave it anyway. They stepped outside under the dim light of the entrance awning. Snow had begun to fall softly, dusting the sidewalk. Harrison searched her face, desperate for something to hold on to, but Sophie's eyes were unreadable. "They're mine," he said finally, his voice low. "Aren't they?" "Yes," she replied. Nothing more. No explanation, no apology, no rage. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you told me not to call. Because you said you were leaving for someone else. Because I was already invisible to you before I even knew I was pregnant." He had no words. None that could undo what had been done. Sophie turned to walk away, then hesitated. She looked over her shoulder and said, almost gently, "You're not the story they've grown up with, Harrison. You're not the reason they smile at night." And then she was gone. He stood in the cold watching her walk away, 3 little girls by her side, all bundled in matching hats, all of them walking toward a car that was too small and old for a woman who had once shared his penthouse. Harrison felt something break open in his chest. The man who had believed he could walk away without consequence, who had convinced himself that emotions were a luxury he couldn't afford, was gone. In his place stood someone hollowed by truth. His daughters existed. Sophie had raised them without him. And now, if he ever wanted a place in that world, he would have to earn it. From nothing. Without privilege. Without power. Just with the simple, human desire to be part of what he had once so carelessly thrown away. The days after the charity event felt like walking through a storm of everything Harrison had once tried to bury. He couldn't erase the image of Sophie standing there with those 3 little girls, his daughters. The haunting symmetry of their faces, the way they clung to her, the way she had looked at him not with anger but with clarity, left him reeling. For the first time in his life, Harrison Gray had no plan. No spreadsheet could calculate how to approach the woman he had hurt or the children who didn't even know he existed. But the one thing he was certain of was that he couldn't walk away again. Not now. Not after seeing what he had lost. He began visiting the small town under the guise of expanding his foundation's local outreach. He didn't announce his presence with press or make large donations that would draw attention. He arrived quietly, kept his distance, and asked no one for favors. He rented a small apartment on the edge of town, a place so unlike his penthouse in New York that he barely recognized himself in it. The floors creaked, the heater was unreliable, and the only view from the window was a row of naked trees. But it kept him close to them. Close to her. He learned their routines. Not by following them, but by walking past the local school each morning where he sometimes caught glimpses of the girls running to the door with their backpacks bouncing. He recognized their names now, Lily, Luna, and Lex, from the teacher's greeting that floated from the open classroom window. Each one had a different energy. Lily was cautious and curious, Luna giggled often and danced in place when excited, and Lex was fiercely independent, often stomping ahead of her sisters like a little storm. Harrison would watch from a distance, frozen by the aching realization that he had missed their first steps, their first words, their first birthdays. The weight of those lost moments nearly crushed him. He began volunteering at the community center where Sophie occasionally helped organize programs for single mothers. He kept their encounters brief, careful not to push. Sophie remained civil but reserved. She didn't scold or accuse him. She didn't cry or raise her voice. That, more than anything, made it harder. Her calm was like a wall built brick by brick from the years she had spent surviving without him. He knew he had no right to ask her for anything, but every time she looked at him, he silently pleaded for a crack in her armor. He didn't try to buy his way in. Instead, he showed up. Quietly. Consistently. He helped paint classrooms. He carried boxes of supplies into the daycare. He fixed a leaking pipe in the center's kitchen. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because he needed to show her that he had changed, not with grand gestures, but with proof that didn't come with conditions. Sophie didn't speak much during those early weeks. But she saw him. She saw the man who showed up even when it snowed, who handed out art supplies to the children with a soft voice and rolled-up sleeves. She saw the man who stayed late one evening after a pipe burst and worked silently for hours, soaked and shivering, refusing to leave until the problem was fixed. And little by little, the edge in her eyes began to dull. One afternoon, as he was packing up leftover boxes from a fundraiser, he heard a small voice behind him. "Why do you keep coming here?" It was Lily. Her blonde curls were a little tangled, and she clutched a stuffed animal in her hand. Harrison knelt slowly, unsure how to answer. "Because there are people here I care about." She looked at him for a long time, her blue eyes piercing. "You look like my sisters." He smiled gently, fighting the lump in his throat. "I know. That's because I'm your dad." There was no dramatic reaction. No tears or screams. Just a thoughtful pause, and then Lily nodded. "Okay," she said, and turned to skip back to her sisters. Sophie must have overheard because later that day, she approached him outside the center, her arms folded tightly around her. She looked exhausted, weary, as if she were preparing herself for disappointment all over again. "They're going to ask questions now," she said quietly. "About you. About us." "I know," he replied. "And I'll be here to answer them. Only if you let me." Sophie studied him, her expression unreadable. "This isn't a game, Harrison. This is their life. Their hearts. I'm not here to win. I'm here to stay." She didn't respond. But she didn't walk away either. Over the next few weeks, Harrison's presence became normal, almost expected. The girls began talking to him more. They asked about his favorite animals, his job, his favorite color. He let them braid his hair with ribbons during arts and crafts time. He read them stories in the community library while Sophie watched from a distance. He was patient, never overstepping, always waiting for their lead. One evening, Sophie invited him for dinner, not as a romantic gesture, but as a moment of peace between two people who shared something larger than their history. The girl sat between them, giggling through spaghetti, arguing over who got the pink cup. Harrison helped wash dishes afterward, hands soaked, shirt splashed, laughter echoing through the tiny kitchen. For the first time in years, Sophie allowed herself to smile, not because she forgave him, but because she saw the truth in his eyes. He was no longer running. Later, after the girls were tucked into bed and the apartment had gone quiet, she handed him a cup of tea and sat across from him. "I don't know how to trust you," she admitted. "Not yet." He nodded. "I'm not asking for trust. Just time." She didn't promise anything. But she didn't say no. And that night, as he left the apartment and stepped into the cold night air, Harrison looked up at the stars and allowed himself to believe something he hadn't in a very long time: maybe this story wasn't over. Maybe this time, he could finally become the man he should have been all along. Spring slowly began to thaw the Wisconsin streets, melting the last of the gray snow and bringing the soft smell of earth and rain. Harrison had been living in the town for almost 3 months now, and though no official line had been drawn, something between him and Sophie had shifted. She no longer watched him with the same guarded eyes. The girls had grown used to him, including him in their drawings, asking for him at bedtime stories when he wasn't there, and sometimes calling him "Daddy" with the casual innocence of children who believed in second chances without needing reasons. And that was what wrecked him most: how easily they accepted him once they felt safe, how purely they loved, even if they didn't yet know the full truth of everything that had happened. Sophie had been careful about how much to tell them. She explained that Harrison was their father, yes, but not the full story behind his absence. She wanted them to have time to form their own opinions, without coloring their minds with past pain. It was a kind of grace Harrison never felt he deserved, but he didn't argue. He simply showed up, again and again. He picked them up from school when Sophie had double shifts at the bakery. He learned to braid 3 sets of tiny blonde pigtails without complaint. He sat through ballet practice on plastic chairs, clapping louder than anyone else. He changed diapers without flinching and learned how to make pancakes shaped like animals, even when they ended up looking more like blobs. Every time one of the girls reached for his hand or rested a sleepy head against his shoulder, something in his chest healed just a little more. Sophie, for her part, watched him closely. Not out of suspicion anymore, but out of study. She had never seen this version of Harrison before: the quiet one, the one who crouched down on sidewalks to tie tiny shoelaces, who didn't complain when covered in glitter, who read parenting blogs late into the night, trying to understand what tantrums meant and how to handle nightmares. She never told him, but sometimes, when the girls were asleep, she would stand in the hallway and listen to him sing lullabies in a voice so soft it didn't sound like the man who had once lived in glass towers and boardrooms. It sounded like someone new. But trust, real trust, still came slow. There were days when Sophie would still flinch at unexpected phone calls, half expecting some lawyer to show up demanding custody. There were nights when she would wake from dreams of being abandoned all over again. One afternoon, when she overheard a woman at the market whisper, "Isn't that the guy who left her?" it was like old wounds tearing open. She went cold for the rest of the day, retreating behind polite words and forced calm. Harrison noticed. He always did. He didn't ask what was wrong. Instead, that night, he showed up with groceries and flowers that looked like they were picked by hand, not bought. He made dinner with the girls and cleaned up afterward. He didn't try to fix it with words. He stayed. That was all. Eventually, Sophie began to let him in more. She told him about the birth, how terrifying it had been, how alone she had felt, how she had prayed just to live long enough to see her babies open their eyes. He listened in silence, his fists clenched beneath the table. He apologized, not in a way that tried to excuse the past, but in a way that carried the weight of knowing he had missed everything. He told her about the months after he left, the coldness he had felt, the hollow success that never filled the place she had once occupied. He confessed that for all his money and power, he had never felt poorer than the moment he saw his daughters and knew he'd never even held them. Sophie cried, not because it was dramatic, but because the honesty broke something open inside her that had been locked for too long. That night, they sat on the porch while the girls slept, the warm spring air wrapping around them like a tentative truce. She let her head rest against his shoulder for the first time in years. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was full of things not yet said, not yet healed, but waiting. Harrison didn't try to force a relationship. He didn't talk about the future. He let Sophie lead, and slowly, her steps began to move closer. They went for walks with the girls by the lake. They had dinner together most nights. Sometimes, when the girls were asleep, they would sit on the floor of the living room, sipping tea, and laughing about things they never got to share before. It was domestic, quiet, and imperfect, but real. One evening, Luna got a fever. Sophie panicked. Her hands trembled as she took Luna's temperature again and again, whispering that it couldn't go higher. Harrison stayed calm. He called the doctor, carried Luna into the car, and held her hand the whole way to the clinic. He didn't leave Sophie's side once. After Luna was treated and resting, he ran to the pharmacy, bought soup and medicine, and sat up all night on the couch, keeping an eye on all three girls while Sophie finally slept for the first time in 2 days. In the morning, she found him slouched in the armchair, hair a mess, shirt wrinkled, one of the twins curled up on his lap. It was the moment something shifted in her completely. She didn't say anything dramatic. Didn't announce forgiveness. But when he opened his eyes and looked at her with that tired, helpless kind of love, she stepped forward, knelt beside him, and whispered, "You're doing it, Harrison. You're really doing it." And for the first time since she had seen his name light up her phone with the message that ended everything, she saw not the man who had broken her, but the man who had begun to put her back together by loving not just her, but the daughters who had become their whole world. The emergency happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day that began quietly, without warning of how everything would change by nightfall. Sophie had woken up with a sharp ache in her side, but she brushed it off as nothing more than exhaustion. 3 toddlers, 2 part-time jobs, and a constant undercurrent of anxiety made physical pain feel almost routine. She got the girls dressed, packed their snacks, kissed their foreheads, and watched them run into their preschool classroom with messy pigtails and shining eyes. But by noon, the ache had twisted into something sharper, something that stole her breath and made her grip the edge of the counter in the bakery where she worked. A coworker noticed the paleness in her face and insisted she sit. She tried to laugh it off, said she just needed water, but within the hour, her legs gave out beneath her. The diagnosis came quickly, an undiagnosed kidney infection that had spread and caused complications. She was rushed to the local hospital, hooked up to IVs, given antibiotics and painkillers. The nurses asked if there was someone they could call. Sophie wanted to say no. She had always been the one people called. But her thoughts were fogged, her strength cracked, and through the haze, only one name surfaced. When Harrison picked up the phone and heard the words, "Sophie, hospital, urgent," he didn't wait for more details. He left everything. A meeting. His phone. His coat. He drove faster than he had ever driven before, heart pounding so loud it nearly drowned out thought. By the time he reached the hospital, Sophie was sedated, sleeping, hooked up to wires and machines that made his stomach twist. The nurse gently explained the situation and asked if he was family. Without hesitation, he said yes. And for the first time, the word didn't feel like a lie. With Sophie unconscious, everything fell on Harrison. He picked up the girls from preschool, their tiny faces brightening the moment they saw him, unaware of the storm brewing. He kept his voice calm, carried them one by one into the car, and answered their innocent questions with soft reassurance. He didn't know how to do this. But he knew he had to. For Sophie. For them. At home, he cooked their favorite dinner, macaroni with cheese and apples on the side. It wasn't gourmet, and it wasn't perfect, but they ate every bite. He read them 2 bedtime stories each, kissed 3 foreheads, and stayed in the hallway until all 3 were asleep. Then he drove back to the hospital and sat at Sophie's side, the silence of the room settling over him like a heavy blanket. She looked so small in that bed, so fragile, and yet somehow still impossibly strong. He reached out and gently wrapped his fingers around hers, whispering that he was here, that the girls were safe, that she didn't need to worry anymore. He stayed through the night, barely sleeping, watching her chest rise and fall, counting each breath like a vow. In the morning, when a nurse came in with charts and medicine, she smiled at him and said, "You're not leaving, are you?" He shook his head. "Not again." Sophie's recovery was slow but steady. When she opened her eyes, Harrison was there, his face unshaven, his clothes wrinkled, but his eyes full of something that hadn't been there before, fear. Not of failure, not of business deals or reputations, but of losing her. She didn't speak right away. She just stared at him, then at the flowers on the nightstand, the drawings the girls had made, taped clumsily to the walls. Finally, she whispered, "You stayed." "I always should have," he said. And for once, no other words were needed. For the next week, Harrison became everything. Father, caregiver, chauffeur, cook. He brought the girls to visit, held Sophie's hand when she was in pain, took notes from the doctors, asked questions she was too tired to form. The girls drew pictures every morning, scribbled hearts and stick figures with wild blonde hair and blue eyes, and handed them to the nurses proudly, declaring, "These are for our mommy." One afternoon, as he sat beside her bed, Sophie reached over and touched his arm. "I didn't think you'd come," she said softly. "Not really." "I didn't think I deserved to," he replied, voice rough. "But I would have crawled here if I had to." She looked at him, long and quiet. The wall she had built brick by brick over 2 years didn't crumble, it simply opened a small door. And through it, he walked carefully, not with promises, but with presence. Not with apologies, but with truth. After she was discharged, he moved into the guest room without being asked. He didn't push. He didn't assume. He made soup, folded laundry, let her sleep while he entertained 3 energetic girls with puppet shows and dance parties. He was no longer the man who once sent a text to end everything. He was the man who swept the floor after the girls spilled glitter, who cleaned muddy shoes with a toothbrush, who left notes on Sophie's nightstand that said things like, "You don't have to do this alone anymore." And slowly, Sophie believed him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some movie moment where everything healed overnight. But it was real. And real was better than perfect. It was her reaching for his hand one morning without thinking. It was her letting him sit beside her on the couch without that space between them. It was her falling asleep against his shoulder after the girls' bedtime stories. And one night, when the girls were asleep and the house was quiet, she kissed him first. Not out of passion or nostalgia, but out of something deeper, a kind of peace that said, "We're not the same people we were." And maybe that's exactly why this can work now. Because what they had wasn't a restart. It was the beginning of something entirely new. Spring had finally arrived in full, washing over the small town with a kind of quiet magic, trees blooming in soft blush and ivory, sidewalks warmed by sunlight, and laughter from children echoing across open parks. For Sophie, life had taken on a rhythm that felt unfamiliar yet deeply right. After everything, the betrayal, the solitude, the fear, the fight, she now woke to mornings filled with peace instead of survival. It wasn't perfect. The memories still lingered, and trust still carried the weight of all it had cost to rebuild. But what filled the space between those old wounds was something stronger than resentment, forgiveness earned, not given freely, and a love that had been reborn not from romance, but from consistency, effort, and the choice to stay, every day. Harrison had become not just part of their lives, he had become home. The girls adored him with a purity that made Sophie ache. They painted his nails during playtime, sat on his shoulders in the park, and told everyone they met that their daddy could make pancakes in the shape of unicorns. He still worked remotely, balancing business calls with bedtime stories, often pausing a video meeting to help tie a shoelace or wipe yogurt off a cheek. His world had changed, and he had let it change him. He no longer cared about magazine covers or exclusive parties or polished boardrooms. He cared about morning snuggles and school recitals and making sure Sophie didn't lift anything heavier than a coffee mug while she was still regaining her strength. Their home, once a cramped apartment filled with second-hand furniture and quiet desperation, had transformed. Harrison didn't buy a mansion or relocate them to a private island. He asked her where she would feel most herself, and together, they found a cozy house near the lake, with enough bedrooms for each of the girls, a backyard full of possibilities, and a kitchen where Sophie could bake without bumping into someone every time she turned around. They painted the walls together, let the girls choose their room colors, and on weekends, they built furniture from scratch, laughing through crooked bookshelves and too many screws left over kind of disasters. Sophie never thought happiness would look like mismatched mugs and glitter stuck in the carpet, but somehow, that was exactly where it lived. 1 year after that fateful charity event where Harrison had first seen the girls and everything had begun to unravel and reknit itself, they returned to that same venue, not for a fundraiser, but for something Sophie hadn't seen coming. She had helped organize a spring celebration for the community, and Harrison had volunteered to sponsor the event again, but this time without the press or grand speeches. The hall was strung with lights and filled with flowers, music playing softly, and families gathered around long tables. Sophie stood at the dessert table, laughing as the girls handed out cookies she had baked, each one carefully frosted with pastel swirls. She didn't notice Harrison disappear. Not until she turned around and saw him standing in the center of the room, looking directly at her, heart in his eyes, and something else, nervousness, maybe even fear. The room hushed slowly, the way crowds always do when something real begins to happen. The girls were the first to gasp when they saw him lower himself onto one knee. Sophie froze. Not from fear, not from shock, but from the overwhelming wave of memory crashing through her. The old Harrison would have done something grand, loud, staged. But this man, the man who had learned how to love her with humility, said nothing for a long moment. Then, in the quiet, with her daughters watching and a room full of neighbors holding their breath, he finally spoke. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. You gave me that already in the quiet ways that matter most. I'm not here to make promises I can't keep. You've seen who I am now, and you know what I'm still learning to be. I'm not here to fix the past, because you already healed more of it than I ever could. I'm just asking for a chance. A chance to stand beside you. To wake up next to you, to raise our daughters together, and to live this life not as punishment for the mistakes I made, but as a celebration of what we've built in spite of them." Sophie didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She looked at her daughters, who had stopped in their tracks, clutching their cookie trays, eyes wide and gleaming. She looked back at Harrison, still kneeling, waiting, not begging, but offering. Not demanding, but hoping. And for the first time since her life had shattered into 3 small heartbeats and long nights of silence, she felt no fear at all. She nodded. "Yes," she said. Not a fairy tale yes, not the kind wrapped in fantasy or perfection, but a real one, rooted in scars and healing and the daily choice to love, even when it's hard. The girls squealed and ran to them, tackling Harrison in a hug that nearly knocked him over. Sophie bent down beside them, wrapping her arms around all 3, and around him, too. The room erupted in applause, but for them, the world had already gone still, locked in a moment they would carry forever. Later that night, back at home, Harrison tucked the girls in, read one more story than usual, and held Sophie's hand as they stood in the doorway, watching their daughters sleep. No part of their journey had been easy. It had been full of pain, sacrifice, and the kind of growth that only comes when everything else falls away. But here they were, together, not despite it all, but because of it. And this time, no one was walking away.